I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source.
It had been clear to John Kennedy from the beginning that the religious issue was the single biggest obstacle to his becoming President of the United States. No Catholic had ever been elected president. The only Catholic who had been nominated for president had been disastrously defeated, so much so that many said Kennedy should not be nominated because it guaranteed the defeat of the Democratic ticket.
You can begin to see those incredible manifestations of anti-Catholic feeling and this popery business. Well, actually, I was going to say in the 19th century with those the fire in Charlestown when they burned down the convent and all, right, which is right here. You could see it from this building where it was, and the anti-Catholic riots in Boston and all the rest of it. But it actually goes well back into the colonial period. How strong these feelings were in the middle of the 18th century. But at that time, it was kind of an abstraction because there just weren't that many Catholics in the United States. There were some, clearly, but it was not, of course, until the Great Irish Migration in the early 19th century that the numbers began to really count and, more importantly, began to have an impact on politics. Because before, obviously, when Irish Catholics became a majority or a very large minority in the city of Boston, they inevitably began to move toward political power. And that's when things got bad.
Well, I grew up as a kid in a very small town in central Kansas, where Catholics were second-class citizens. That's said, I don't know whether it's true or not, that the Klan burned a fiery cross in front of our little parish church. I don't know. What I do know is that it was almost impossible for a Catholic young woman to get a job teaching in a public school, not only in Newton, Kansas, but in the whole state. In the early and the mid-20s, Catholic papers in this country concentrated attention on the Klan almost every week.
In the 1920s, the Klan had 2 million members. In 1928, there were 7 governors of 7 different states who were members of the Klan at the same time. In 1924, this was. 7 governors, and 3 of them from northern states. And that's pretty hard to imagine, but there it is. The Klan marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, 50,000 strong, past the White House in 1924. And the Democratic National Convention in 1924 debated the question of denouncing the Klan, and it failed by a few votes.
I know a lot of young people now who never heard of that happy warrior, the New York man in the brown derby, who ran for the presidency of the United States in 1928. I remember him well. Some Deep South papers said that if Smith were elected, every American citizen would be expected to kiss the Pope's toe. Smith never did that, and neither did I. In the 1928 campaign, there was a lot of bitter disappointment that Al Smith had been so soundly beaten by that good, honest engineer from Iowa, Herbert Hoover.
On election night, when it was clear that he had lost and lost by a great margin and lost New York, which was very, very painful to Smith, that he lost the state that he had elected him governor 4 times. He didn't even carry New York State, although his friend, in quotes, Franklin Roosevelt, who was succeeding him as governor, did win in a close election. But he spoke to Roosevelt that night, and he told him, well, he said, Frank, I guess it's just not time yet for a man to say his beads in the White House. The fact that 32 years had passed since Smith's candidacy, and of course that Smith had lost, at least in part because of religion, made it very difficult for Kennedy to overcome a lot of resistance within the party, interestingly enough, from a lot of the party's most prominent Catholics, like Governor David Lawrence of Pennsylvania, Mayor Daley, and others, who were very, very worried about whether or not he would lose. And more important, that if he did lose because he were a Catholic, that it would set back the position, the advances that Catholics had made politically in the country, because it would reignite a lot of the bad feeling that had existed in 1928. And they were just ready to say, just leave it aside. And of course he was able to prove in the campaign that he could overcome it, but I think to a large degree he didn't overcome the religious issue so much as he was able to project his own very attractive personality and the fact that he was so intelligent and all the rest of that, which came through very well in the West Virginia primary, where they brought in FDR Jr. with the magic name to interview Kennedy on television in West Virginia, and he raised all of these questions about the religious issue, and Kennedy confronted it very forthrightly, saying, you know, was I eliminated from contention on the day I was baptized, and that kind of thing. And people responded. There's no question about it. And he surged in the polls. He had been way behind Humphrey, and ended up with a 60-40 win. So, but the issue would not go away.
As we traveled about the country, we encountered signs that were hostile on religious grounds, people holding up signs in the crowd. Sometimes a question would be shouted at him. Somebody in the crowd shouted out, "Do you believe all Protestants are heretics?" He said, "No, and I hope you don't think all Catholics are." Then things took a turn for the worse in September. Kennedy had hoped that he had cleared the issue up in the West Virginia primary, in a very full statement to the American Society of Newspaper Editors on the issue, in appropriate references in his convention acceptance speech to the issue, but he had not cleared it up. It had not gone away. And the hate mail, the hate literature being distributed around the country, the unbelievably vicious anti-Catholic, anti-Kennedy on Catholic grounds, statements being made, continued to rise. The Protestant ministers of Houston, Texas, had their own organization, and they decided that they would ask Vice President Nixon, the Republican nominee, and Senator Kennedy, the Democratic nominee, to address their September meeting. Given this surge of anti-Catholic talk, Senator Kennedy felt that he had no choice but to appear. And he asked me to prepare a draft of the speech.
From Houston's Rice Hotel, Senator John Kennedy is about to address a special meeting of the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, to which he has been invited.
From my seat in the audience, it was clear that the tension in the room was very thick. A certain amount of tension on Senator Kennedy's part, because he knew that this speech could make or break his hopes for the presidency. Tension on the part of the ministers, because many of them were still locked into the views that they had brought to that meeting.
Reverend Herbert Mesa will introduce the Democratic presidential candidate.
Contrary to common propaganda, the South is not a hotbed of religious or racial intolerance. There are many honest minds that are raising honest questions. Many Catholics differ with us on many questions that are relevant to the welfare of our country. The fact that the senator is with us tonight is to concede that a religious issue does exist. To that end, I should like to introduce at this time the senator from Massachusetts and the Democratic candidate for the President of the United States, Senator John F. Kennedy.
I'm grateful for your generous invitation to state my views. While the so-called religious issue is necessarily and properly the chief topic here tonight, I want to emphasize from the outset that I believe that we have far more critical issues in the 1960 campaign. The spread of communist influence until it now festers only 90 miles from the coast of Florida, the humiliating treatment of our president and vice president by those who no longer respect our power, the hungry children I saw in West Virginia, the old people who cannot pay their doctor's bills, the families forced to give up their farms, an America with too many slums, with too few schools, and too late to the moon and outer space. These are the real issues which should decide this campaign. And they are not religious issues. For war and hunger and ignorance and despair, no religious barrier. But because I am a Catholic, and no Catholic has ever been elected president, the real issues in this campaign have been obscured, perhaps deliberately, in some quarters less responsible than this. So it is apparently necessary for me to state once again, not what kind of church I believe in, for that should be important only to me, but what kind of America I believe in. I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him.
This was a speech that was designed primarily to ease Protestant fears that were based on legitimate reasons and questions that had been raised. There was nothing we could do about the hate mail and the bigots who were convinced that no matter what a Catholic said, he should not be elected president. But at the same time, we hoped the speech would not stir up bitter attacks from the Catholic hierarchy. After the Huston speech had been drafted in full, I called on the telephone a theologian who was one of the leading spokesmen, at least from the liberal point of view, on church-state relations, Father John Courtney Murray. And I read the entire speech, probably a 25-minute speech, to him over the telephone to see if there were any objections that he would have or if he thought it would raise a storm. This is, I said to him, the senator's position. This is what he believes. This is what he's going to say. And while I can't recall the details of my conversation with Father Murray, my recollection is he said, go right ahead.
Finally, I believe in an America where religious intolerance will someday end, where all men and all churches are treated as equals, where every man has the same right to attend or not to attend the church of his choice, where there is no Catholic vote, no anti-Catholic vote, no block voting of any kind, and where Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, at both the lay and the pastoral levels, will refrain from those attitudes of disdain and division which have so often marred their works in the past and promote instead the American ideal of brotherhood. That is the kind of America in which I believe.
This was going to be a part of a swing through Texas. Included in that swing through Texas was a visit to the Alamo in San Antonio. So he said to me, find out how many Catholics were killed at the Alamo. So I called our research office in Washington. I said, give me a list of all the Catholics who were killed at the Alamo. And they called back about 3 in the morning of the very morning of that speech. And they said, well, I mean, here are some names of those who were killed. And they gave me names that sounded Irish and Hispanic among those who were killed. But he said, of course, we don't know what their religious affiliation was. Well, that became a passage in the speech.
This is the kind of America I believe in. And this is the kind of America I fought for in the South Pacific and the kind my brother died for in Europe. No one suggested then that we might have a divided loyalty, that we did not believe in liberty, or that we belonged to a disloyal group that threatened, I quote, the freedoms for which our forefathers died. And in fact, this is the kind of America for which our forefathers did die. When they fled here to escape religious test oaths that denied office to members of less favored churches, when they fought for the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, and when they fought at the shrine I visited today, the Alamo. For side by side with Bowie and Crockett died Fuentes and McCafferty and Bailey and Bedelio and Carey, but no one knows whether they were Catholics or not, for there was no religious test there.
It was very effective. And he did appeal to this fundamental sense. I think Americans do have a fundamental sense of fairness. And a lot of people in the audience, so maybe not a lot, some people in the audience did say to newsmen afterwards that they were very affected by what he said, and they thought it was, made a lot of sense.
Whatever issue may come before me as president, if I should be elected, on birth control, divorce, censorship, gambling, or any other subject, I will make my decision in accordance with these views, in accordance with what my conscience tells me to be in the national interest, and without regard to outside religious pressure or dictates. And no power or threat of punishment could cause me to decide otherwise. But if the time should ever come, and I do not concede any conflict to be remotely possible, when my office would require me to either violate my conscience or violate the national interest, then I would resign the office, and I hope any other conscientious public servant would do likewise.
That's virtually exactly what he said. If there were ever a point at which my duties were in conflict with my conscience, I would resign. He said that in the Huston minister's speech. And there was an audible kind of, you could, in the audience, a lot of these, it was an incredibly hostile audience. Very, very hostile audience. But the speech was brilliantly done, and I think even more so the question and answer session at the end.
We plead with Senator John F. Kennedy, as the person presently concerned in this matter, to appeal to Cardinal Cushing, Mr. Kennedy's own hierarchical superior in Boston, to present to the Vatican Mr. Kennedy's sincere statement relative to the separation of church and state in the United States and religious freedom as represented in the Constitution of the United States, in order that the Vatican may officially authorize such a belief for all Roman Catholics in the United States.
May I just say that as I do not accept the right of any, as I said, ecclesiastical official to tell me what I shall do in the sphere of my public responsibility as an elected official, I do not propose also to ask Cardinal Cushing to ask the Vatican to take some action. I do not propose to interfere with their free right to do exactly what they want. There is no doubt in my mind that the viewpoint that I have expressed tonight publicly represents the opinion of the overwhelming majority of American Catholics.
Mr. Kennedy,
and I think that what my view, I have no doubt, is known to Catholics around the world. I'm just hopeful that by my stating it quite precisely, and I believe I state it in the tradition of the American Catholics, way back all the way to Bishop John Carroll, I feel that I hope this will clarify it without my having to take the rather circuitous route. This is the position, I think, of the American Catholic Church in the United States with which I am associated.
We appreciate your forthright statement. May I say we have great admiration for you. But until we know this is the position of your church, because there will be many Catholics who will be appointed if you're elected president, we would like to know that they too are free to make such statements as you've been so courageous to make.
Well, let me say that anyone that I would appoint to any office as a senator or as a president would, I hope, hold the same view of the necessity of their living up to not only the letter of the Constitution, but the spirit. If I may say so, I am a Catholic. I've stated my view very clearly. I don't find any difficulty in stating that view. In my judgment, it is the view of American Catholics from one end of the country to the other. Why? Because as long as I can state it in a way which is, I hope, satisfactory to you, why do you possibly doubt that I represent a viewpoint which is hostile to the Catholic Church in the United States? I believe I'm stating the viewpoint that Catholics in this country hold towards the happy relationship which exists between church and state.
Do you state it with the approval of the Vatican?
I don't have to have approval in that sense. I have not submitted my statement before I read it to the Vatican. I did not submit it to Cardinal Cushing. But my judgment is that Cardinal Cushing, which is a cardinal from the diocese of which I'm a member, would approve of this statement in the same way that he approved of the 1948 statement of the bishop.
You have been watching Senator John Kennedy appearing before the Greater Houston Ministerial Association in an unrehearsed question and answer period. The telecast
If you look at 1960, it was considered so radical that somebody of the Catholic faith would be running for president, and the great fear that they would be a puppet of the Pope, the Pope's puppet, whatever it is. And so I think it was a terribly important speech because he stood there as a person defining his private core and his public responsibilities and how those fit together.
I remember my dentist neighbor across the street, who was a very strong Baptist. He believed when John F. Kennedy was elected, the Pope was going to move into the White House, almost literally. And at one of the first press conferences, President Kennedy was asked about aid to parochial schools, and the questioner said the bishops have asked for aid to parochial schools, and President Kennedy said, I disagree with the bishops. Well, my neighbor was just dumbfounded. He didn't think any Roman Catholic president could say that.
I am very sensitive to the fear that some Monsignor is going to tell me how to vote, or some bishop, or some nun. I think that's a fear that no one ever needs to entertain, because it isn't done. They do lobby you for certain causes, and many of them I am not sympathetic with. I was unsympathetic to the bishop's pastoral on peace, but they conceded in that pastoral that these are questions of prudential judgment. But at the same time, I accept and solicit the views of churchmen because I think they have something to tell us, and out of the wisdom of the church through the centuries, I think they ought to be listened to. But only in matters of faith and morals would I feel obliged, and I must say no one has ever told me how to vote on abortion.
Kennedy said in that Houston minister's speech that he would not accept the dictates of any clergyman on matters of public policy, and that he would voice his protest if anyone attempted to dictate to him. I think if he were alive today, he'd be spending a lot of time protesting, because unfortunately some members of the hierarchy today have tried to dictate to public officials what their position should be on abortion.
You can never have legality equal morality in a pluralistic society. The law will always have to be a compromise, as long as you have a pluralism of religious and moral views. On the other hand, way back in 1977 or 78, the Saturday Review of Literature editorialized on a statement that President Carter had made, that he had a problem with federal funding of abortions, especially where there was a moral question involved. And the editorial writer said, how can he speak of a moral question when the Supreme Court has declared it legal? Well, if that was the attitude of this sophisticated journal, American people are in very bad shape of not being able to distinguish between legality and morality.
If I should lose on the real issues, I shall return to my seat in the Senate, satisfied that I tried my best and was fairly judged. But if this election is decided on the basis that 40 million Americans lost their chance of being president on the day they were baptized, then it is the whole nation that will be the loser in the eyes of Catholics and non-Catholics around the world, in the eyes of history, and in the eyes of our own people. But if, on the other hand, I should win this election, then I shall devote every effort of mind and spirit to fulfilling the oath of the presidency, practically identical, I might add, with the oath I have taken for 14 years in the Congress. For without reservation, I can, and I quote, solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, so help me God.
And defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
My God, they're talking about the same issues as we did 32 years ago. The poor children that go to bed at night hungry, the old people that can't pay their bills, the people that are losing their homes, and the farmers, and he'd say, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed.
At the cathedral, a pontifical funeral mass is to be said for the repose of the soul of the first Roman Catholic president, and Cardinal Cushing, an old family friend, blesses the mortal remains of John F. Kennedy.
I know that when I speak to students, I used to call Kennedy the first Catholic president, but I have stopped for about the last 10 years. I now call him the only Catholic president. Because I think after 32 years, you have to begin to wonder,